again, crunch numbers, like we were talking about earlier with other things, about market value of things, because you have the fees as well, which is a very sensitive topic.
It is, and
the
that's
license fees.
And that's paid to Ofcom, isn't it?
Yeah.
So that's part of your working capital, isn't it? Ofcom.
Yeah, but
they've got to keep going. You've got to pay something.
I'm not saying they're not entitled to get a bit where they've got to pay for Harry's
they've got to pay
smartwatches.
You've got to have a regulator. You can't just not have one.
Can you imagine if you had a gold Rolex?
Yeah. Yeah,
I would definitely tell you it was a knockoff if
Harry came in just blinged up. Then we would we'd have some questions there. Hello and welcome to another Telecoms.com podcast. It's we did do one last week. I thought I'd been a gap. Oh, that's it. You've been away. Ian's been away in Dublin at an event called Fyuz that we're going to hear about. And I'm delighted to say we've got a very special guest this week, who's Harry from Ofcom. We've never had anyone on from Ofcom, or I think a regulator, or indeed the public sector at all, Harry. So you're definitely a very honoured guest. Yeah, indeed. So thank you very much for coming on. And obviously there's all sorts of stuff we can get into there. Before we get into that, just a couple of bits. My only sort of preliminary bollocks is that went to an event hosted by Interdigital. And our mate, oh God, I've forgotten his name. He was on the pod. I'm going to have to look it up in a panic now. But our mate who we had on the pod from Interdigital was there. And they were just opening their new office, and just talking a bit 6G. Mm-hmm. It was quite a good chat because, my default, and as we've covered many times on this pod about 6G, is to be a bit sceptical along the lines of, we haven't even worked out what the fucking point of 5G is. Why are we talking about 6G? And they sort of gently pushed back a little bit. Here we are, Rajesh Pankaj. Sorry, Rajesh, for forgetting your name before I had to look it up. So he was on
especially as you met him on Monday.
I know. Well,
that's terrible.
I'm terrible. I'm getting old and I drink too much. That's my excuse. Just a shout out. Congratulations on the new office, Interdigital.
Was there anything on the 6G front that was new that they said? Because I remember last time they did an update. I think I went to that one about a year ago, and they were talking very much about sensing and reflective surfaces and
more of that.
It's just more of the same.
More of that. Okay. They had some specific use cases. They were talking about some non-6G stuff as well to do with, I think, video files, and you can do some clever stuff with video files where you can sort of transpose a 360 video image and put it into new environments. Yeah. So there's some clever stuff because they don't just do telecoms.
The sensing was the stuff that seemed to excite them a year ago. They had these that's the one where you could see it being quite different from what 5G's been.
Well, that's exactly my takeaway. And we've got the 6G hexagon.
Yeah.
Which is built on
it's a hexagon, is it?
Yeah, so it's the 5G triangle. And
shouldn't 5G be like a pentagram or something?
Yes, you'd think so. Yeah. At least they got back into the themed numbers. Yeah, but the pentagram's a bit too devil worshipping, isn't it? You got to be careful there.
Very appropriate, though, isn't it? I mean, look what's happened to it.
Fair enough. I don't think it's quite gone in the satanic direction. But yeah, look, just to remind you, I'm just showing Ian on my laptop the 6G hexagon. And what the 6G hexagon, it basically joins up. The 5G triangle had 3 points, which was enhanced mobile broadband, i.e. a fatter mobile broadband pipe, massive communication, which is basically more IoT type of stuff, machine to machine. And then the interesting one, or at least the really novel one, was the ultra low latency. Those are the 3 points of the 5G triangle. And then 6G, they've superimposed a hexagon joining up each of those points.
Right.
Sensing is one of them. Sensing joins up the enhanced mobile broadband and IoT one, I guess. But then there's ubiquitous connectivity and AI and communication. It's all a bit vague, but I agree with you. Sensing's the only really novel thing.
I think trying to join things up is a bit contrived with that, because sensing to me sounds quite different from... I mean, he gave some wacky use cases. I remember he had a glass of water on the table and he was saying that you could sort of... It's like the radio fingers go into it and work out the dimensions of it, and you can create another...
Yeah, it's like a sort of super duper radar. Yeah. Harry, has 6G come across your radar at all?
Yes, but I mean, I think that on this, and this goes to the point about who's Ofcom generally, we don't pick winners and losers.
Yeah.
I think that's a really important point with this, as well as all the other things we do, because you talked about what's 5G for, and we don't.
You're not there to.
We're not there to say, well, we should have 5G or we shouldn't have 5G. It came along and we facilitate that and make sure that.
This is the research stage,
so and we might get into it more a bit later. Where Ofcom will have a perhaps more active hand is like new spectrum and that sort of thing. But yeah, that was it really. I agree with you, Ian. It is mainly about the sensing. It's basically for people. If people want it in words of one syllable, it's an idea of using telecoms networks, wireless networks, perhaps in combination with other technologies like LiDAR or whatever, to create this sort of ubiquitous radar.
Yeah.
And you can imagine, no one's claiming they know what it would be used for yet, but you could imagine there would be some utility to just being able to constantly sense your environment, certainly for things like robots.
It's when you're in the pub and your pint's running low, and then they can figure out that they need to come and bring you a pint. That's my
like
killer
smart
app.
Fridges that have cameras that look at when you're running low on milk and
that
while you're
kind
in
of
the
thing.
supermarket.
Yeah, but this is more instant because it's you just sort of meters away from the bar, but the barman gets a little signal saying I need to. It's probably a robot by
Well,
then.
we should.
So
do you know what?
Comes over and gives you your
Put a pin in that one because that might come up when you're telling us about some of the chats you had in Dublin.
Okay.
In terms of bar efficiency.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's it really. Not much more to. I don't want to have a big chat about 6G. Just that's the one thing I went to. Our colleague Teresa was there as well, and thanks for hosting us into digital. What have you been up to, Ian?
I've been away in Dublin since Sunday. Got back Wednesday night, I think, at Fyuz, which is used to just be called the Telecom Infra Project Conference or something, the TIP event, but I didn't. The Fyuz branding's supposed to imply, I think, the fusion of different technologies that you get.
And
with
it's spelled
Open RAN
FYUZ, which is slightly annoying.
Yeah, it's just trying to be clever, really. But
trying to be cute.
But it was going for a couple of years in Madrid until this year. They moved it to Dublin.
How was that? How were the Guinnesses?
Good, actually. I quite like Dublin. It's a nice city. It's sort of easy to get around, and the convention centre's central, and the hotel was next to the convention centre, so it was more manageable than Madrid.
Oh, okay, so you weren't like in downtown Dublin. Did you get to go and hit the town at all?
I mean, we were pretty close to downtown.
Oh, okay.
That was the big difference with, like, Madrid's a big city, yeah? Madrid. It's lovely, but it's very big.
That's where I had my stag do, Madrid.
And the conference centre is quite near the airport in Madrid that they were doing the Fyuz event at.
You're set aside.
People weren't staying there, a lot of them. They were staying in the centre, but travelling out each day on the metro. And whereas my hotel was next to the convention centre in Dublin.
Cool.
So it was like fall out of bed.
Okay, so everyone could, and more opportunity for spontaneous larks afterwards.
And I think the changes, I mean, I thought attendance seemed fairly thin, especially on day one, compared with. I mean, it's not a huge event. It's about Open RAN heavily. It's about disaggregation, and it's not just Open RAN. It's openness and virtualization and general compute.
Opening
and
up of the general telco kit space.
So it's very network orientated, and it's quite specific to what some people in the industry do, although quite relevant for our titles because it's the network nitty gritty. So we cover that a lot, but
and we will we'll also,
and the CTOs are there, those sorts of people from the telcos and or people just below that level.
That you get excellent people turning up.
You get good people.
I mean, we'll come back to that because I'm going to ask you more about the actual telecoms stuff that you wrote up and learnt from that. But you did. You wanted to give a shout out to some of the people you bumped into. By the way, I was chatting to Declan from Babel, and he went, there were a few Guinnesses left on the table for your absence. He said that to me.
Yeah. But
carry on, sorry.
No, I mean, I suppose because we cover it a lot, people know us. People who go there kind of know the titles, and I mean, you do find you had that, I think, at Network X, people coming to you and saying they like the podcast, and it's always nice to hear when people say they like the podcast. But I had quite a few people coming over, which was good. But Tim in particular, who'd sort of connected to me on LinkedIn in the run-up, a guy called Mariusz, and his colleague
I commented
Lars.
on that LinkedIn
Yeah, there's
thread.
a photo. But I mean, they'll hear this because they listen to it, and they're from a company called, I'm going to pronounce this wrong, but it's Tietoevry, I think, which is like an IT company in Finland that is involved in doing some RAN development. I mean, I said we'll have a chat at some point about exactly what you guys are up to, but they're really big fans. I mean, they kind of came over and
cool.
It's kind of strange, like having people that are sort of that enthusiastic, but also really quite nice to hear. So yeah, shout out to those guys. Also, Telecom TV, I should probably give a shout out to, which is a competitor of ours.
But they're mates as well.
But they're mates, and Sean, I sort of, he was very generous with the outings and the sort of
good man,
allowing me to come out for dinner with them, I think, and tag along.
That's very kind of him.
That was kind of very nice of him. Who else was there? Another shout out to someone that we're hoping to get on the pod in a few weeks. I won't give the date because you never know, things happen. But Ronnie at Cohere, who I spent quite a bit of time with over there.
Okay, cool.
Cohere is a really interesting company in this, like in the Open RAN area.
Yes, they are.
Not just Open RAN. I mean, the technology they have, which is like a sort of capacity boosting technology on existing sort of radios, like 44R radios, is really innovative, and actually got a lot of call outs at the conference by Vodafone. They're kind of really interested in it.
Cool.
So, and I hung out with him quite a lot. Again, he's very generous in the evenings with the old fashions and this sort of thing. So, I've been spoiled basically.
And you were telling us just before, which I thought was quite funny, and is related to this 6G killer app that Sean from Telecom TV had some sort of ground rules for going to the pub
proficiency pass system that he wants to.
I'm sure he won't mind you sharing.
No, I mean he does listen to us at the pod sometimes, so he might hear. But we were at the airport, and you know those sort of weird queues form behind people. Whereas at a normal pub, everybody just stands by the bar. Yeah. And he's like, this just shouldn't happen at a bar. Like you don't queue at a bar.
Right.
You don't get to the bar and order cocktails.
Yeah.
He's like, anything that stops me from getting my pint more quickly is on the list of.
I know. Especially if it's like the first pint of the evening and you're gasping.
And then there's the barman needs to know like who's, you were Harry talking about that. The barman needs to sort of keep an eye on who's at the bar first.
Yeah.
Does
got to manage that,
which is kind of
interesting conceptual debate about demand side and supply side interventions.
There we go.
Yeah, I mean that's not one for the consumer, obviously, but
I think we should have a off bar. bit of top down management of this shit. Get some order into it.
Yeah.
Cool. All right.
So it was good. It was, and I've got still stuff to write up from it, so it was a really good, worthwhile trip, I think, from my side.
Excellent. Actually, just one other little thing I wanted to. Last week I was moaning about the EE roaming in Istanbul, and saying that I only got 100 megabytes for £8.50 a day.
Oh, someone came over to me and talked to me about that.
All right, well, let me quickly
correct
the record. It's actually 500 megabytes. It's still quite stingy, but it's 5 times more than I said, so I just wanted to correct that.
So Kevin Holly from BT, who I had dinner with one night, he's like head of standards, I think, at BT, but he said, I want to talk to you about Scott's complaints about the roaming stuff. And I went, yeah, go on. Then he was like, why didn't you just use an eSIM?
He's totally right.
I know,
Kevin.
and I didn't even think that. And I'm surprised that when we were talking about it, Neil didn't say something.
He's totally right, and I was aware of that. I was chatting to our colleague Dario when we got the taxi from the airport, and he was talking about eSIMs, and I suddenly thought, my God, I've been a telecoms journalist for 10 years.
I know.
And I'm still such a noob.
And then he showed me this app. It
didn't occur to me to get an eSIM.
Dean Bubley came running over, and because he travels everywhere. So he's got an app that allows you to pick the best deal on the eSIM. And
Dean, if you're listening, send me a link to that.
I'll find out from him what it is, this sort of aggregator.
No, I really felt like a fucking idiot for not even thinking of it.
Yeah.
And when you do an eSIM, do you get to keep your number?
Yes, I think that's how it works. You can't apparently make phone calls. But you can. But
so
you
it's
can
just
do
a data thing.
But you can do it on WhatsApp.
Indeed.
So you just have to route it to WhatsApp or Teams.
I've had one experience with eSIMs and it was awful. But maybe that's just the one app I used or something. Yeah. It just kept cutting out. I had to
What can you remember?
Turn it off, turn it back on.
Should we name and shame them?
No, I don't remember the provider, but yeah.
All right.
It was the country I was in as well.
So anyway, to was it Kevin from BT?
Kevin Holly.
Kevin Holly. You're right. I should have, and it's just a blind.
He also watches the pod, so he'll hear that.
Right. Okay.
So hi, Kevin. Yeah.
I've really got to look into it properly. I actually think the eSIM is sort of under publicised. In terms of like, if it doesn't even occur to me how many normies would think of it, or maybe they would. I don't know. Have you ever used an eSIM, Harry?
No, I haven't. It's probably similar
roaming
to someone at Ofcom being out of contract, actually, which I was until today. I've just switched.
Oh, right.
So we've all done it.
Yeah, exactly. It's funny how we can have that separation between the day job and the rest of your life.
Yeah.
You'd think there'd be more overlap than there actually is.
Take it for granted.
Yeah. Cool. All right. Well, we'll call it a day there on the opening bollocks. Not too bad. It's only about 10 or 15 minutes.
It was less than last time.
Yeah. Well, I had to bang on about Istanbul last time.
14.
14 minutes. There we are. So I think Harry. I mean, the subject of Ofcom and regulation, all that sort of thing, so big, and my personal experience, while I have plenty of interaction with Ofcom via press releases and that sort of thing, I don't, until I've met you once before, I don't have too much interpersonal interaction with Ofcom people. Hopefully that will change. Yeah. But I just think we just start from the top in terms of, and bear in mind that, this is published digitally, so it's got an international audience. Why don't you just start from the top by positioning Ofcom, what the point of it is, and its sort of broad remit, and then we'll just dig down into specifics after that.
Yeah, so about 20 years ago, the likes of telecoms companies and broadcasters and postal operators and all that kind of stuff, all the communications sectors.
Yeah, the COM stands for communications.
Yeah, they were all regulated by separate siloed regulators.
It was Oftel, wasn't it?
Oftel and...
do we know where the off etymology comes from?
Office.
It's just office.
Yeah,
right, okay.
Office of Water, Office of Energy.
Fair enough.
And someone had the idea basically about 20 odd years ago because things were converging. One of the popular C words in our sector to basically combine into one regulator all of these sectors that were converging. So for about 20 years now, we've been regulating broadcasters, telecoms companies, spectrum, postal operators, like I said as well, and then most recently we've become the online safety regulator.
On which more later.
Yeah,
that's a pretty broad remit, isn't it?
Yeah, and we've grown with that remit, particularly recently with new legislation, not just the online safety legislation, the Telecom Security Act. We've had more duties under that, so we've grown under that as well. But yeah, we've we get a lot of Ofcoms too big and a lot of Ofcoms too small. We get a lot of Ofcom does too much and Ofcom doesn't do enough.
If you're getting it from both directions.
Has it led to some, because as you're saying, they did different things before. And I mean, this is almost relevant to the chat about censorship and stuff like that. But in combining those things, I mean, this is to the structure of the department, I guess. Are they still very separate sort of departments, or has it led to some kind of blurring of lines and and sort of issues about how resources get allocated? Because it sounds like almost like when you do these converged things, one of the things you have to realise is cut how much you spend on each one.
Yeah, I mean there are there are separate teams who cover these separate sectors, but within larger groups within Ofcom, and there is benefit in having that sort of proximity to what each other's doing, because there's that convergence. So if you take Amazon, for example, Amazon is the one company I can think of that we regulate under all of those things, because they're a postal operator. They use Spectrum for their satellites. They're a telecoms company. They're a streamer. Yep. And they're an online platform as well. So, if you still had those siloed regulators, all those separate regulators would be having to talk to each other about all these things that Amazon do, which kind of overlap with each other a little bit.
Yeah, makes sense.
And even, having Ofcom do all these things, we have to talk to other regulators, other digital regulators, the CMA, the ICO, about these things as well. So you would just have more regulators having to talk to each other about what these companies are doing on a converged basis now.
Yeah,
it's interesting that you said that you get people moaning about too little and too much regulation, which is probably the ideal. Like the BBC, when it's defending its own impartiality, likes to say that it gets people who accuse it being too lefty and too righty, and that's probably good. It's probably doing something right.
Points of view, isn't it, or whatever it's called now? They read out people's letters.
Right.
I was very disappointed to see the episode.
Oh, you're talking about points of view from like back in the 80s
they still
and 90s.
have it though. It's just called something else now.
Please. Yeah. Put on more shit that I like.
That's basically what every letter says.
Yeah, exactly. And less shit I don't like. What were you thinking when you put on that stuff I don't like?
Mary Whitehouse used to be the person who wrote.
Yeah, exactly. It used to be quite sort of prim and censorious.
And we do on the broadcasters. We do get let's say, roughly 50% of people saying you're too hard on a certain broadcaster News. And 50% saying you're not hard enough on them.
So there's an interesting one. I actually don't, this wasn't at the front of my mind coming in, but one thing that's put Ofcom in the spotlight has been GB News. And GB News for non-Brits is a relatively new TV station, started up, 2 or 3 years ago, something like that. It kind of, to very loosely position it, it sort of kind of positions itself as maybe a UK Fox News for Americans, it's sort of representing the more right of centre side of things, as opposed to the perception, which is one I largely share, that most broadcasters and legacy media tend to sort of veer. Actually, no, it's probably more broadcasters. Our newspapers in the UK, I think we've got a really good broad spectrum. In the States, you look at CNN, MSNBC, NPR, all that sort of thing. Quite a lot of them seem to be a little bit more pro-Democrat. Like a lot of them are just having fucking nervous breakdowns after the election. And then they got Fox News, which kind of sets itself up in part. This is my understanding. I'm not a consumer of it. I just get this from podcasts and stuff I listen to, in part as an antagonist to them. And I think that's kind of how GB News has positioned itself. But it has been dinged a few times for a lack of impartiality. Is that correct?
Yes. In fact, we fined them recently for multiple breaches of impartiality rules.
And one of them was that time when they had a big chat. I didn't watch it. Again, I just heard about it with Rishi Sunak before the election.
Yeah.
I mean, again, I wasn't necessarily planning to go here, but do you have a sense of why? How did they transgress by chatting to the Prime Minister and a political candidate?
So it's all about what the individual content is in the context of that, because it's not the case that GB News purely puts out news bulletins, because, so for example, there's a lot of different rules. Definitely. Yeah, there's chat elements to it. There's chat programs, discussion programs, as well as the news bulletins, and you get different levels of rules that apply to, say, news bulletins that apply to chat programs. And you get different levels of rules that apply to matters of significant public interest. Yeah. So the Prime Minister talking in a general election campaign would fall into that category. And so there are heightened rules around due impartiality, and the word due is always important here because, like I said, it's all to do with context. You can't be 100%
impartial at every second.
There aren't, and there's no formula to it, and it's all about context. So we look
at... it's a bit subjective.
We look at the individual thing, the piece of content, and make a ruling on that based on the context.
But that perceived subjectivity will presumably be one of the reasons why people will moan at you. I firmly believe it, and I welcome you to get more into that, because we chatted a bit beforehand, that your guiding principle is to be impartial. But then, as you probably know only too well, people will project their own agendas and biases and all that sort of thing onto you. But when you appear to be making a subjective ruling, reminds me a little bit of like debates I have with my mates. I don't know if you have the same about football. Like two of my mates are Arsenal fans, and basically any time Arsenal gets a decision against them, they start questioning the impartiality of the referee and all that sort of thing. And it's become a joke now, but there was a time when they firmly believed there was some kind of anti-Arsenal agenda. I don't know, Pierre, you're an Arsenal fan. Do you share that kind of? Pierre's nodding.
Of course he does. That's pretty much the same with all football.
Well, exactly. I'm only picking at Arsenal because it just so happens that the two mates of mine, my brother and...
It's more that I think there's a pro-Manchester City agenda rather than...
Pro-Man City?
Yeah, okay. Which in our case, because we've been runners-up...
Used to be pro-Man United, didn't it?
Yeah, like...
It was in hindsight, it 100% was.
Yeah.
Yeah, Fergie time, where you had this really long injury time. I think in hindsight that was mainly just more the personality of Alex Ferguson. He just scared the shit out of referees rather than it being a more endemic sort of baked in thing. Anyway, but that's a similar thing, isn't it? And I guess to perhaps overextend this metaphor, often Ofcom is the referee, isn't it?
Yeah.
And so it stands to reason that when you make a refereeing decision that people don't like, people are going to cry foul.
Yeah, and in the football analogy, a bit of an elbow is not de facto are breaking the rules. So, you have the referee there to decide when it crosses the line.
Yeah,
totally. That's their job. Just say if you want a beer, Harry.
Oh, well, yeah.
Our beers are at your disposal.
Yeah, it depends where we go with this, whether or not I need one.
Sorry, you were going to say something, Ian?
Yeah, I was just on the. I mean, we can come back to the censorship stuff, but just on the approach to the telecom market specifically, and because the classic, you said the word referee, but that's what the expectation of a regulator is, I guess, that they ensure fairness and that there aren't breaches of competition rules and that sort of thing. But do they stray into? I mean, it's quite an interesting article in the Economist this week, I noticed, on the whole, the UK being a rich country with the worst, you've probably seen it, with the worst 5G in the world or something, and I didn't quite agree with everything.
It's a bit harsh, isn't it?
Well, I do think it doesn't have very good 5G.
Is this coverage?
I mean, well, they've drawn on some open signal data that isn't very favourable about speed, but I mean, you've been in buildings in London where you can't get any signal.
Yes.
It's far, far worse than it is in the rest of Europe. And they were trying to get to the bottom of it. And I think some of the things they said weren't quite right in the story about why we've sort of lagged. But the question I'm trying to ask, I suppose, is does Ofcom look at things like that and go, oh no, we need to do a better job of ensuring the UK is at the top of the 5G league tables? Or is that something that, because they do have their market updates and they go on a lot about coverage and then they sort of draw in these other country comparisons. But to me, I'm almost thinking, what's that got to do with Ofcom in a way? Isn't that what somebody else should be worried about, some other government department?
Well, so actually it's interesting that you mentioned government department, because we do get set directions from government in terms of priorities that they want to see. So, for example, improving broadband and mobile coverage. And then depending on what the market is producing in terms of technology, we then look to facilitate that to the benefit of consumers. But like I said before, without picking winners and losers.
Facilitate what? Sorry.
Facilitate, the rollout of that technology. So if the rollout of 5G requires some spectrum, we're there to facilitate that. If the rollout of full fibre requires, well, in our view, some competition to make that happen, but also some what's sometimes referred to as juice in the system, so that there's some money where that investment can come from. Then we'll facilitate that with the regulatory framework. So with this prices we set OpenReach, for example, but then the rules we set on OpenReach to not behave anti-competitively, so we can get that competition.
But
that's a delicate one.
The fibre one's interesting because there was this. Go back a few years before when the country wasn't doing very well on fibre rollout, and I think it's in a much better place now. I think everybody would say that. But this is sort of Gavin Patterson at BT era.
I had he knocking on my door just this week.
Yeah. Well, they do. That's what they're.
But I mean, no one else. I get them quite often in my area, just being quite active about trying to flog me for it. But I've already got it with BT.
So they wouldn't have been trying to sell you fibre at all a long time ago, obviously, because they didn't really have very much, and that was a sort of Gavin Patterson era of them being very focused on, it seemed, sports, and the strategy kind of pivoted. But it seemed like the pressure for that to some extent came from either government or regulators, and there was this idea that they might be forced to sort of separate out OpenReach, and I know there's been some degree of separation that's supposed to have made that easier. But was that something that Ofcom was very involved in? Because it was never very clear. It was okay.
Yeah. So that was 2016-ish. We did a big review, 10-year review of the market in 2015, and one of the outputs of that was legal separation of OpenReach from BT in 2016, 2017, and there are some tangible outputs that we look at from that to sort of gauge whether that's working. But then some less tangible ones, like just talking to their their ISPs and their competitors to get a sense of whether
is
actually
it working?
Broadly speaking, I mean, so on the tangible outputs, like you said, we're in a much better place now when it comes to full fibre. I think back then, 2016, it's sort of less than 2%, and now we're at 3/4, something
Yeah,
like that.
I always think it's hard to make up your mind whether it was that or, I mean, I suspect it's a combination of both, but there was also this big sort of pile-in of investors into the fibre market, which had multiple reasons, I think. I think there was some government impetus there to get funding in, but I think the pandemic kind of helped to sort of make them look at fibre assets differently. And
that's why we wanted the competition, because
and BT goes, no, we need to build, otherwise we're going to lose.
Two things. That is the first mover advantage.
Yeah.
Actually give Openreach a reason to invest themselves, and then also give consumers choice and drive innovation. And competitors are more likely to, if you have competition, more likely to come up with innovative new technologies, rather than if you just have one player.
Yeah,
I wonder. I remember at the time when the legal separation thing came up. Sounds a bit like a divorce, doesn't it? And I thought it felt like a bit of a fudge. And a fudge isn't necessarily a bad thing. I am British after all. We're proud of our ability to fudge. But it felt like a bit of a fudge in so much as it's a separation but not a separation. Clive Selley still reports into now Alison Kirkby. Is that her name? Yeah. So it's not a separation in that way, and she can presumably sack them. I'm guessing. I don't even know. We're assuming that.
I think it's kind of Chinese wall. You're not supposed to say Chinese walls anymore, are you? Apparently, but
politically incorrect.
It doesn't sound politically incorrect to me, so I'm going to say it. It's like Chinese walls, basically, between different bits of the business. I've no idea why that's politically incorrect. That just sounds like a stupid thing to be politically incorrect.
Any sort of racial or national generalisation can.
Okay, about a thing that the Chinese are really proud of.
The wall,
okay.
yeah.
Anyway,
but it's about it. There are some kind of tangible things like physically not being in the same office, for example, like really small things like that. But actually, again, talking to the ISPs about how they feel about whether BT retail are being treated the same by Openreach. And there was a whole rebranding. The Openreach vans got rebranded, and so there are some symbolic things and some very strict things, like you said, the actual physical separation of people in BT and Openreach. And the structure is basically that BT are 100% shareholders in Openreach, if you want. They own them. But
is there concern that it's one thing it's done very well is get Openreach building, and they're now, I don't know, 14, 15 million homes. I think they're well on course to doing this target of 25 by 2026 or something, I think. But this concern keeps getting raised. What about kind of sustainable competition? Like, a lot of the altnets don't seem to be in particularly good financial health or have good take-up rates. And I think even the main one, City Fibre, was sort of raising concerns about funding in its last annual report. Is there a concern it could just become another, we've got it done, but it ends up just being another one big infrastructure company and that dominates the market?
Well, you already, before we had this growth in competition over the last few years. You already had the two main players. You already had Virgin in the game, and they were actually formed by a sort of round of consolidation of cable companies.
Yeah,
way back
NPL,
when.
all that stuff.
Telewest, I think.
Yeah, Telewest, Cable and Wire, all that jazz.
Yeah. So, again, going back to market forces, if there is consolidation, that, again, we're not here to pick winners and losers. We're here to let the market forces play out, but just make sure that there's a level playing field. So, you'll get the competitors of BT and Openreach raise concerns with us about their behaviour, and then we have to be the referee on whether or not that crosses a line of being anti-competitive, like discounts, for example.
Yeah, well, the thing that was particularly controversial, I remember recently, was this Equinox system, wasn't it? Which was
that's the tariff.
I have to refresh my memory of what it was. I mean, maybe you can explain it, but it's their wholesale pricing, isn't it, for some of their fibre?
Yeah, it was a deal, basically a discount deal that they offered their retail ISPs to incentivise take-up of full fibre, basically.
Right, and the concern was that they'd set it at a level that made it hard for other people to.
I think other players in the market thought it was a bit low, and it was kind of forcing.
It was almost, what do they call it, predatory?
Yeah, exactly. Because in principle, as the dominant wholesale supplier and the former national monopolist, in an unregulated environment, they could just run at a loss until everyone else was dead,
yeah,
and then recoup their losses down the line. That's one of the biggest things that you need to keep an eye on with people who are in a dominant.
But this is what you've got teams of people working on who go and crunch the numbers and build those complex spreadsheets and go, well, actually, they're not doing that, and we think it's okay for this to be. Yeah,
that's exactly right. And the level playing field and allowing competition goes both ways. So we've got to allow Openreach to compete in this market as well as its rivals, but there's with its position it has, we have to look very carefully at these things to make sure that they're not crossing a line.
Yeah.
So constant balancing it, and you must have people moaning in your ear the whole time from all different directions. It's a really interesting, again, back to the football analogy, you know when the ref's got all those players around him gesticulating and shouting.
Do they do a lot of looking at what's going on in other markets to sort of get a sense of best practice and see what could be sort of introduced here?
To an extent, we'd always want to make sure that if there's anything we can learn from other markets, we are learning that. But there are differences. If you're talking about different countries, for example, it's amazing the extent to which topography can have an impact on the market in Spain, for example, or even just other geopolitical factors like the number of what are they called, MDUs, multi-dwelling units, tower blocks, just things like that. So yes, there are some things we can learn, but there are some differences as well.
Well, this is something that a couple of people in Fyuz were telling me actually, and I think it may be relevant to that Economist article, but one of the issues for 5G coverage is just difficulty of getting access to buildings in the UK and the fees that landlords are charged, this sort of thing. Yeah,
that is a big one. Is that an Ofcom thing that handling access?
Well, so apparently one thing that happened, I didn't know about, but I was chatting to someone at Ookla about this, is that they lowered, I don't think it was an Ofcom decision, but rates got lowered on rooftops for what you charge the landlord for putting up mast equipment in this. Yeah,
because that obviously has to be regulated. Well, otherwise, the landlords would hold them to ransom the whole time, wouldn't they?
Well, so the idea being that this would sort of spur take up, but Ookla's take on it was that it's actually made landlords go, well, we can't get as much money from sort of putting,
so we won't bother.
So they don't bother, and there's not like a sort of strict requirement for them to open up their premises to put 5G masts on.
So the incentives have got to be
so
there.
it's forced a sort of look at like neutral host infrastructure instead, and street masts that don't look sort of like eyesores when you put them up and this kind of thing. But it's quite hard. It's quite a hard sort of, like you say, juggling act to sort of keep all parties happy when you're trying to do this sort of stuff in urban areas, especially.
Yeah, and the short answer is that a lot of that comes from government. So what I was saying to Scott earlier was that government sort of set an envelope, a framework within Ofcom to operate and, set policy to a certain extent and regulations. But ultimately, there are policy decisions that are made by government that feed down to that. And a lot of the masts and rents issues and access to blocks of flats and things come from government. And they've been doing things with the Electronic Communications Code over the last few years and other sort of bits of legislation on that front.
That's something as we've chatted about before, Harry, I'll often write quite strident stuff about areas that Ofcom's involved in. But I think a lot of the time when I feel most sort of indignant or most outspoken, it's more the public policy. And we'll come on to like the online safety bill and stuff, because that's something I've definitely ranted about at length, which you know only too well. But that's an example of a government policy where most of my eye was directed at the drafting of the law, and we can get into that because you did point out to me when we've chatted previously that there were some refinements to it that I might not have been fully aware of. But yeah, you get draft. I think it's like sloppily drafted law, and this is just as bad for regulators as well. If a law's drafted in a vague way that's open to multiple interpretations, that's just hard for everyone. Especially you guys, I would imagine.
Yeah, and the government. To be fair, the Parliament and government have to strike a balance in how they write laws to, for example, try and future-proof them, particularly when it comes to something involving technology, fast-moving technology. Try and make it technology neutral and future-proof. So if you set it too prescriptive, then you might end up having to keep going back to it. Whereas if that's where the balance is. If you set it at a higher level, principal sort of level, then you've got a better chance of future-proofing it with fast-paced technology developments. So then what they say, if you take the Online Safety Act as an example, but there are others as well that we've got in the other sectors, we set regulations, the sort of details below the higher level laws, and we can usually update those more quickly. But again, we try to future-proof those as well. But that's generally how it works. And a bit like with the Vodafone 3 CMA process that you guys were talking about last week and we were talking about earlier, they're the decision maker, but we'll offer our sectoral expertise, and so when laws are drafted, often will.
Well, we should talk about that for a bit.
Yeah, I was just going to ask very quickly if has a CMA. So I know this is a CMA thing, not an Ofcom thing. The Competition Markets Authority. They decide over big M&A, and this is a big potential merger in the UK that looks likely to go through, subject to certain remedies between Three and Vodafone. But does the CMA formally or informally consults Ofcom in its deliberations?
Yeah, and they'll it's no different to anything they do. They'll go to the sectoral regulator for their expertise and data, and so
because they've got to be generalists, so they'll dip into your expertise. You're going to ask something.
Well, one of the things that seems to have been a barrier to these sorts of mergers in the past is, and especially when we were members of the EU, was this idea that you need to have 4 mobile operators per national market. This sort of the magic number.
Which always felt a bit arbitrary.
It did, yeah. It did feel a bit arbitrary to me. But I remember when Vodafone and Three were coming out with their sort of rationales for doing it, and they would actually draw. I think we probably corresponded at the time over email, but they were drawing on Ofcom data about return on investment and it not being particularly good, it below the weighted average cost of capital or whatever it is, however they manage it. But almost suggesting that some of the those hardline principles about whether it needs to be 4 players or 3 players were changing a little bit. Has there kind of been a softening of that on the Ofcom side of things, that we don't need to have 4 players anymore?
Yeah, there's certainly been a change in stance from Ofcom over the years on that, because I think, let's say about 8 years ago, we did say publicly that at the time, as the market was at the time, we thought that we thought that it wouldn't be beneficial to consumers to go from 4 to 3.
And what was the top line reason for that? Is it just less competition equals bad?
Yeah, we as we often say, as we talked about with the full fibre and in the retail telecoms market as well, competition has delivered proven benefits to consumers. So we were concerned that if that were to happen, that it wouldn't be beneficial. But the market's changed. Markets evolve, and as the market's evolved, a few years ago we did a review of the mobile market, a holistic review, and we said, look, for some of the reasons, among many that you've just mentioned about returns, for example, we would look at anything like 4 to 3, just on the merits of the circumstances at the time, rather than their starting point being that.
Not being dogmatic about it.
Yeah. Which is good. That's all we can ask.
Yeah. No, because it seems like there's a certain amount of dogma still, I think, within the EU about this idea that you have.
Although we had that Mario Draghi thing a few months ago, where I thought that do you remember that? He had this paper saying that EU's kind of dropping the ball when it comes to global competition.
Yeah, but we get this all the time within the EU. Is someone
and then
someone who's sort of employed to do something saying, "Oh, well, this is how we should really be doing things."
But it did resonate a fair bit. I've heard a lot of people, whether they do anything about it is another matter. I share your scepticism there, but it did seem to resonate.
I remember when I first joined Light Reading in 2015, and I was at a conference with Ray and the European. So who's the current one? Vestager's the one who's been around for a while, yeah? And before that, it was Vivian, I can't remember her name even.
Oh, yeah.
She was doing a talk on regulation and her position on this, and there was all this speculation about the EU softening its position and becoming more kind of pro-investment and less sort of pro-consumer. And 10 years on, it's still the same thing is going on. So I'm always a bit dubious that anything's going to change on the EU side of things. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting looking at what's going to happen in the UK, because it sounds like philosophically there's no reason why we couldn't have a 3-player network market. It's just working out the details more than anything, I suppose, at the moment. It's the stage we're at.
Yeah, and like we have, there'll be teams of people crunching the numbers on this, and you guys covered all the sort of proposed remedies that the CMA came out with last week.
And I think you've already, I can't remember if it was before we started recording or after, you've already indicated that when those proposed remedies come up, those that are down to Ofcom to enforce, you'll do. So I'm kind of guessing that you don't really have a position on the deal as it is now and the proposed remedies. You're just in a wait and see.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, I think there was one where we'd have involvement in the proposals, and we would just be ready to do that if there was any involvement.
Well, the involvement, I think, was on the ones that seemed likely to get introduced, which is these behavioural ones, where I think they're prevented from raising prices for some of their tariffs for a certain number of years, and then they would also monitor the capital expenditure of the two combining companies to see that they spend what they've said. But it sounds that wouldn't be done directly by the CMA. It sounds like they're expecting Ofcom to sort of step in and do that.
CMA moves on to the next bit of M&A, doesn't it?
Well, to me, it seems curious because I'm not aware of Ofcom having done that before, of actually having looked at somebody's capital expenditure in detail and monitored it in that way. And I personally don't see how it would really work, because it doesn't sound like the right thing to be monitoring to me. But
well, I mean, we monitor Openreach's capex, and it's sort of with its significant market power and the rules that we set on Openreach, we do look at its investment. But it's we do a lot of monitoring of things like, so for example, the kit, the sort of Huawei stuff, we've just been given purely monitoring job on that. Hand it over to government for them to enforce.
You just give them the data on what the state of play is at a given operator.
Shared rural network.
So they have to report, someone like whoever, BT has to report into you every whatever time frame, this is how much Huawei kit we still got in our network.
Yeah, we've already had a couple of reports. I think we had one in June or
Do you publish
March.
That?
No, we hand them over to government.
I was going to say, that'd be a cool thing to get hold of.
Well, sometimes that data gets released anyway. Right. You got 3, I think, saying recently we're at below 35% on traffic now. And
same with the shared rural network. So we monitor that, and they were releasing their own data, but we collect that.
Shared networks, is that going to be an Ofcom problem? Because that's a really thorny part of the...
the network sharing part of it.
What are the name of the two network sharing groups?
MBNL and Cornerstone, I think.
KBNL and Cornerstone. And then Vodafone's in one of them and Three's in the other. And they're going to have to reconcile that. That's going to be a really thorny one too.
I don't think they've decided it's a thorny one.
No? They're just going to let them have both?
No, I think we talked about this last week, but the CMA's position on it is that it's not something that they need to worry about too much.
Because they let it sort itself out?
They're not letting it sort itself out. They just don't think it's something that really needs to be. The indications are that it's not something they really need to worry about.
Okay.
They don't think the information is that useful to... So BT's the one that's mainly objected to this. BT said that it doesn't like the idea of the merged Vodafone 3 having sort of insight of what it might be doing in terms of deployment, because they've got a role in MBNL, and sort of being able to use that to sort of influence what it's going to do through the other one,
and
which is Beacon.
Market intelligence type of thing.
Market intelligence, and then decide what to do about investments. And they said they didn't like that. The CMA's this is very brief. There's like pages and pages on this, but very briefly they sort of went. They don't think that the information would be that useful.
I see.
And BT doesn't. I know that BT is quite resistant to that position. They're kind of pushing back. But I think it's probably got to the point now where it's too late to really sort of do anything about that. I mean, we're a month away, not even that now, before a decision. And I think the last paper that came out from the CMA was very much not treating that as a concern anymore.
Fair enough.
So whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, we'll kind of see. But I don't think that's something that's going to prevent the merger from going ahead. The thing that's going to prevent the merger from going ahead now is really what Vodafone and Three are prepared to do on the behavioural remedies. Yeah. Signing up to some system where Ofcom comes and basically monitors their capex and makes sure that they're meeting some sort of spending commitment each year, which I think, I mean, you were saying it's happened with Openreach. I think it's quite an unusual thing on the global stage to have ever happened in mobile. I'm not aware of that ever been done, and telcos have said that to me as well. But
yeah,
and I also think it's the wrong thing to monitor because, as I say, I think capex can easily be wasted. They could go. I think James Crawshaw said this. They could go off and spend that money on a bunch of GPUs. Whereas what you really want to monitor is things like coverage and service of it, the sort of stuff that Ookla might measure, for instance, or Open Signal, which I think they do anyway. Ofcom, they have you get a license, you have to meet certain coverage commitments, so that's the thing to monitor. It's already done, and then the next question is, if they don't meet these capex commitments, what's the CMA going to do about it? Are they going to say, well,
what's Ofcom going to do about it?
We're going to
because by that stage it will have been passed on from the CMA. I mean, my understanding of the CMA is it's there to green light or not the merger, but then once it's happened, the enforcement is someone else's problem.
Nobody realistically expects. I think this is one of the problems: is enforcement of. Yeah. Enforcement's an issue, I think, for Ofcom in a market where it's very capital intensive and you've only got 3 or 4 networks and costs always get passed on to customers anyway. I think everybody's suspicious that they would ever come along and say, here's a really hefty fine that's going to make you, that's going to make you suffer. Or take a license.
Yeah, so one example of monitoring and enforcement is the shared rule network, which was an agreement between government and the mobile operators, and then we were given the job to monitor and enforce the targets, the coverage commitments, and the way it was done was to include them in the license conditions. And then it's just a case of we have a suite of enforcement tools and we can use them at our discretion in just enforcing those license conditions. And fines is one thing, but as we've seen from the retail telecoms market, for example, we recently fined BT about £3 million for breaching our general conditions and by not giving their retail customers contract information. Okay. And it wasn't just a fine, though. It was send these customers that information, go and find any customers who have left who didn't get that information and were charged exit fees and refund them, and put right your systems so that you are doing this now. All these things like.
And if you haven't, then there's more fines down the pipe.
That's
or some
always an option, but
a critic would say, well, 3 million, that's like finding Scott sort of a fiver, and he'll just sort of do it again because 3 million for BT.
I don't get out of bed for less than 3 million.
And I get why they don't want to put more hefty fines on because it's going to make the consumer suffer at the end of the day anyway. But I think that's the problem, is that the behavioural remedies themselves, to me, are not really an effect. And it's not Ofcom's decision, I know, on the behavioural remedies front, but I don't see them as being a very effective mechanism to sort of police or restrict this merger and get it to do the things that...
What do you think? Things like you just described. And by the way, who gets that 3 mil?
Treasury.
Right, just straight to the Treasury.
And the thing about levels
Ofcom doesn't get to shave off a little.
No, it all fines go to the Treasury. But the thing is that kind of announcement gets a lot of publicity, and we know the companies don't like that kind of publicity. In fact, we publish our league tables on the telcos every quarter about complaints we get, and the complaints have come down over the last 10 years since doing that because they're fighting massively to not be. So publicity plays a big part, but also, like I said, it's not just the fine. We ordered them to do X, Y, Z as well. So there's more than just a fine.
Yeah, so I'm getting that impression that you have to use quite a lot of, I guess, market signals or qualitative or anecdotal evidence points to work out whether something's working or not. And I imagine a lot of what Ofcom people are doing when they're not being on drunken podcasts is just crunching through all that data, some of it straight up numerical data, some of it unstructured and anecdotal and all that sort of thing, and trying to form a coherent picture of the link between an action and the end consequence of it. And that's all you can, I think, really ask for, is that these things are evidence-based and methodical.
Yeah.
And, something like this 3 mil, I think Ian's right, the amount itself, I mean, I wouldn't completely trivialise it, but yeah, in the great scheme of things, it's not that much.
It's fairly trivial. 3 million.
And as Harry was saying, perhaps as much of it is not so much the figure, but the fact that it's big enough to make it into the papers, and then it's a reputational problem for them.
Yeah.
But then you presumably have ways of looking at that after you've watched that 3 mil go right past you to the Treasury and thinking, oh, what I could do with that. Yeah. But then you've got a sense, 6 months, a year, whatever down the line, what effect that has had, and then presumably that will affect policy down the way. If it's had fuck all effect, then you've got to think about a different way of intervening next time. Is that all?
Well, so the policy was just set recently, and so it was new rules that they just didn't comply with when the new rules came in, and these things, everyone else is complying, and they are having an impact. People are getting better information, and we were talking earlier, that's usually our focus, is just making sure people can understand things and have the information, rather than stepping in with lots of interventions on prices, for example. But Royal Mail, I'm right, thanks. Royal Mail is a good example, actually. Just briefly going off telecoms, because we fined them £50 million a few years ago. But they have this monopoly position, a bit like OpenReach does. But just because
they've got much bigger things to worry about at the moment.
Again, it's about not picking winners and losers. Because even if you have a monopoly position, another company should be allowed to have a go at coming in and trying to compete with you, and that's what TNT/Whistle tried to do. But Royal Mail set some pricing policies that breached competition law, and we fined them £50 million. And so these things are important, and it's all depends on the context. 3 million, 50 million. It depends on the transgression, and there might be some other stuff that goes with it as well.
Did they come to you for? Because the other thing that on the remedy side that upsets other telcos, one in particular, is the spectrum situation, and it seems like they're not going to do anything other than expect the merged companies to sell a bit to Virgin Media O2. And by the way, we don't know how much I don't think we know how much they've offered to sell. They've just said we've got a deal with, unless you've been told, Scott. I certainly haven't. I've not read it anywhere. But
you know better than to look to me for extra insight into the situation.
So we don't really know what that does in terms of rebalancing. But I know there's this concern about a big imbalance in certain bands that are considered to be important for 5G. So presumably the CMA would have come to Ofcom to ask for sort of advice on that. And kind of curious why they don't seem to think it's a problem, because that seems to be the implication.
Well, they come to us for data and advice and our expertise on a lot of things, and we'll give them that. But ultimately, it's their decision. They're the ones that will make a call on what's a concern and what needs to be done about any concerns.
Right.
Talking about spectrum, auctions.
Yeah.
In the past, I've had some strong opinions on auctions, just because it can feel a bit like, profiteering is probably the wrong word, but it can feel like a bit of a deliberate exchange of funds from the private sector to the public sector, because the auctions seem designed to extract the highest possible price. And then we have things like, I'm sure it's before your time, but I'm sure you're also aware of it, the 3G auctions, where all the operators paid through the arse for this stuff that turned out to not be useful for about another decade or so, or not very useful. And that was in effect a wealth exchange from the private sector to the public sector. So my question is, firstly, whether you have any thoughts on what I just monologued, but also does Ofcom have any input into how spectrum gets allocated?
So I think it's fair to say that public commentary or trade commentary around what you were just saying has dissipated from auction to auction. It's fair to say there was a lot of those comments about the 3G, like you said, and then a bit less about 4G, and then
the prices
still
don't
about
seem
the
to have
latest
been
5G.
so
But ultimately, it's about we'll again, crunch numbers, we were talking about earlier with other things, about market value of things, because you have the fees as well, which is a very sensitive topic.
It is, and
the license fees.
And that's paid to Ofcom, isn't it?
Yeah.
So that's part of your working capital, isn't it? Ofcom,
but we're...
Well, they've got to keep going. You've got to pay something.
I'm not saying they're not entitled to get a bit where they've got to pay for Harry's
they've got to pay
smartwatches.
You've got to have a regulator. You can't just not have one.
Can you imagine if you had a gold Rolex?
Yeah.
I would definitely tell you it was a knockoff if
Harry came in just blinged up. Then we would we'd have some questions there. But yes, obviously you've got to get some revenue, and that's one source. But back to the thing. My feeling is it can seem excessive at times, and your pushback that it's become less so over time.
That's the best source, surely, though, isn't it? Is to get the companies themselves to pay directly for the regulator, than to take it from like income tax or whatever.
Yeah,
no? Yeah. So that's how it works.
I think that's fair enough. Yeah,
government set a kind of envelope for the fees we get, or for auctions or for annual license fees for spectrum. They'll say it has to be based on market value and that kind of thing. So we crunch these numbers based on that sort of steer from government on these things.
But it doesn't have to be an auction. You could just say you could just dosh it out. You could say we've got 4 operators. Well, we still do. And go, right, each of you get a quarter of it, and this is the price. And you cannot pay it and not have a quarter of the spectrum that we're doshing out.
I think the important thing to remember, though, is that the companies want a regulator. Yeah, really.
Yeah.
Nobody doesn't want a regulator.
Totally. I want a regulator.
Unless you're John D. Rockefeller, in the old days.
I am the first.
You want a regulator.
I've said it those before on the pod. You have to have a regulator because markets will end up gravitating towards monopolies if you don't.
And the likes of Three certainly want a regulator. The smallest guys always want a regulator. Everybody wants something to be pleased. So it would make sense. So if you want it, then you should pay for it.
But that's not my argument. My argument isn't that people shouldn't have to pay for spectrum. It's that the auction system seems designed to maximise the amount that people pay for spectrum.
Well, it establishes what the market value of it is, because if we just decided what people had to pay, then that would be the most efficient way of establishing the market value.
That's a good rebuttal. As someone who's pro-market, I can't really argue with that, can I?
Yeah.
Fair enough. It's just... you see some, there was the 3G one, and fair enough, that was the market value. If they choose to bid each other up, then more fool them. And then, recently, I think a 5G one, they went a bit crazy in Italy. Do you remember?
Well, I think you've got to structure it well. And I think the criticism of the Italy one was that they structured the licenses where 2 of them actually were quite a low allocation of spectrum, and 2 of them were a generous allocation of spectrum. And so everybody went for the 2 that were a generous allocation of spectrum, and it inflated spectrum prices, so that the Italy auction is way out of kilter with every other 5G auction that happened in terms of.
So perhaps just that specific one was structured badly.
I mean that was pretty much every analyst I've ever talked to about it is that the Italians just basically cocked up their system. Okay, I think they did it deliberately, by the way, because they thought here's a good opportunity for a windfall. 7 billion, I think that one raised.
Exactly, and that was my. It's that windfall. That's my sort of pushback. It's just like, just as you have to have a regulator, you have to have a state. I'm not an anarchist.
Who would expect the Italian government to do something like that?
How dare you? The Italians are no more or less corrupt.
The Italian government.
Yeah. I'm going to move on a little bit just because we want to cover some other news, and I've been sort of threatening to bring up the Ofcom's sort of major new arm to its business, which is informed by the Online Safety Act, which was passed a few months ago, was it?
A year ago.
Was it a year ago? Shit. And yeah, I'll tee it up from my point of view. I've, on the pod and in my writing, as you've noticed, Harry, written some fairly strident stuff about it. Where it comes from for me, I'll admit, and it's an interesting thing actually chatting to you about something that I have strong opinions on, because as a journalist, I think journalists should be objective. I think journalists should try and report the truth, even if they're doing news analysis. They should still try and do it objectively, or at least make it clear when it is their opinion, be transparent about when they're injecting their opinion into what they're writing. And I will admit that there are certain things, especially as it concerns the public sector, where perhaps at times I'm a bit self-indulgent and I lean into my sort of ranty self a little bit. I certainly wouldn't be hypocritical enough to apologise for it because I wrote it and I stand by it. But on reflection, I try and sort of stay my hand, like my current bugbear is more to do with US policy as it affects global trade and telecoms and that sort of thing. And sometimes, like I wrote one this morning, sometimes I'll sit there and fucking pounding the keyboard going, rant. For anyone who's not watching, I do a sort of camp typing gesture.
Tyrannosaurus Rex doing typing.
And then I'll sort of stop for a breath and I go, okay, let's just recap and see how much of this is useful informing my audience and how much of it is just me being self-indulgent. And there may have been times when I've been talking about this subject where I've been a bit self-indulgent. But anyway, having framed it that way, my big objection, before Ofcom was even a glint in politicians' eye on this particular subject, my issue is I think it was originally Nadine Dorries who was bringing it forward under the Boris Johnson government. And I thought, firstly, it was really badly drafted law. And there were certain things in it, like the most signature one, which I understand from you, actually, Harry, that they got rid of. And somehow I missed that official moment when they got rid of it. But they were talking about... So it was called the Online Safety Bill at the time. And it was to do with putting down guardrails. And once I finish this, correct me if I've mischaracterized it in any way. Putting down guardrails for the digital domain to protect people from the worst stuff that you can see on it. And the stuff that was a no-brainer is anything that protects kids. I've got kids. My kids certainly, I've probably not been a very good parent. That I've let YouTube do far too much parenting over the years of their upbringing. But I think, God, it's a challenge for any parent not to do that, but that's another matter. And obviously it helps to know that when they're on their phones or on their tablets or whatever, that there are some external guardrails, because I'm being a slightly negligent parent and not policing what they're doing. But then you can't look over their shoulder 24/7, can you? And so I have got no objection to any of the stuff to do with kids. And that obviously even covers stuff that isn't illegal, but is fine for adults to consume if they choose, but not for kids to consume. I've got no pushback on that. Where I had issues, I think they were twofold, really. One was a particular stipulation, which they certainly tried to have in this bill for a long time, where they talked about legal but harmful. And my issue with legal but harmful is any law that chooses to police something that's legal but, I think it's just wrong. I mean, it's either legal or it's not. That's what law is. Legal's just the adjective for law. So, and I thought that was also very slippery and deliberately vague.
Yeah, if it's so harmful, it should be illegal.
Yeah, quite. So don't say legal but harmful. And then my other one was...
No, I agree with you on that.
Was another sort of slippery slope concern I had, which was that all this stuff was being put in place to protect kids, which I stress again, I'm totally in favour of. But then I just felt there was a mission creep where sometimes in the phrasing of the law, it looked like they were trying to apply those same safeguards to adults. And I think, as soon as you're a legal adult, if you want to consume some fucked up stuff on the internet, as long as it's legal, then that's your business, and it's not the job of the state or the regulator to protect me from my own shitty choices online. So that's how I felt. So I've teed that up. What are your feelings about some of my criticisms of it and versus the reality and what it is now? And then also, could you talk a little bit about Ofcom's role? Because I mean, Ofcom's done a lot of hiring just to execute this policy. So over to you, Harry.
Yeah. The concerns about freedom of expression, privacy, which are, really important legal rights, are understandable and important concerns. And it actually goes to one of the, back to myth busting about public sector and why things take a long time. The Online Safety Bill took years to get through Parliament. It was debated for years. And that's part of the reason, because these are really important considerations to debate about freedom of expression, for example, when it comes to all the stuff you were just talking about, content that's legal but harmful to adults, which was at one stage part of the bill. For example, legal forms of misinformation.
Which in itself is an incredibly vague term.
So that was taken out completely, and it didn't make it into the final legislation, that part of it, because of the result of those debates about freedom of expression, for example. So what you've ended up with is broadly speaking, these two pillars I mentioned to you earlier about illegal content that you were just talking about, and some stuff that's legal but harmful to children that they shouldn't be seeing, and we wouldn't let them see offline, like pornography, suicide, self-harm, eating disorder content,
grooming, all that sort of stuff.
Cyberbullying.
You what?
It's all right for you to watch them, though.
Yeah.
So that's the problem, though, isn't it? It's hard to police things on the internet because it's available to everybody. That's the legal but harmful side of it, because it's not appropriate for someone who's 12, but it's okay for you.
But that wasn't the legal and harmful side. I don't think we have any disagreement among us that anything that legislation and the regulator can do to protect children. I mean, you could even argue, I don't know if it's in law, but certain things are illegal. I mean, obviously, loads of things are illegal for children that are legal for adults. You know, that's why we have age of consent.
But it's hard to. But on in the world of the internet, you can stop a shopkeeper from selling cigarettes to someone under 16 because he has to ask for ID. But how do you do this on the internet?
Totally.
So again, because it's tricky. Again, it's why it can't be done quickly. So that's why we've been spending a year sort of creating the details in the codes of practice that internet companies are going to use to try and navigate these duties. Where, for example, with illegal content, they're going to have to make decisions about whether something is illegal.
Yeah.
And then make the decision to take it down if they think it's illegal. So we've got a whole bit of guidance on making judgments on whether something's illegal. And then on the kids' side, age verification technologies come on a long way, but it's not perfect. So again, it's about what they can do to find out whether one of their users is a child, and then what they can do to make sure they have a different experience to adults on their platform. But going back to the legal but harmful to adult stuff, where the legislation ended up is they took out the bit that says they're going to have to take stuff down that's legal but harmful or protect people from it, and move towards giving people more control over their experience. So you might be an adult that doesn't want to see something that's legal that other adults want to see. So, there'll be things that people can do to, if they don't want to see that, to make sure they don't see it. And also, if you go onto a platform and that platform's terms of service, their community guidelines say, we don't allow this particular thing to happen on our platform. That's their decision. That's their business. That they actually enforce that. So if someone goes on that platform going, okay, I'm going to go on this platform because it says this isn't allowed and I don't want that, and it happens anyway, I think that transparency and empowerment of the end user, I'm totally in favour of. You can't say fairer than that. Let people know what they're letting themselves in for, but it's not the role of the state to tell me what's good for me. Yeah. So, Scott, I don't think you should be looking up whatever fucked up stuff that I'm looking
Scott.
at. Yeah, well, I mean, so there you go. That's what?
Illegal.
Yeah, but this is the problem. I know it's not an Ofcom problem, but I hate the fact that hate speech as a word is used as a basis for law because it's so subjective. How could you define hate speech? No one can define it. Anytime a law or a rule or a parameter or whatever comes up that no one can define, presumably hate speech doesn't cover I hate pistachio ice cream. And presumably hate speech doesn't cover I hate you, Ian. And so then it tends to be along all sorts.
I don't want to get banned completely.
I hate Ian. That's not hate speech.
Well, no, it's about certain characteristics.
It's defined across demographic lines. But again, I certainly don't want to go too far down this rabbit hole. But it's subjectively enforced. So some of these demographic things, the hate speech tends to, in its enforcement, work in one direction rather than another. So without being too specific, I'm much more likely to be a deliverer of hate speech as a straight white bloke than I am as a recipient of it. All these things, I don't like it, and I'm not getting the world's smallest violin out, poor me, but I don't like it because it biases, and this is a complete tangent, it's nothing to do with Ofcom, but it biases a law. It creates different tiers of law for different people along demographic grounds, and I just don't think I don't think it's enforceable in a even-handed way, and I don't think it's healthy. But yeah, I take your point. Hate speech is illegal, but I challenge you to define it. Could you?
Well, so this goes back to, say, disinformation, for example. There are
another one.
Legal forms of disinformation, and there are illegal forms of disinformation. So,
and they're made up on the fly. This is my biggest issue that I had about the online safety bill. Once it was clear that it would be down to Ofcom to enforce it is I worried that it felt like a degree of politicisation of organisations like Ofcom, who I've got no intrinsic grievance with at all. And as we just discussed, we need a regulator. But, the overall chief of Ofcom is Dame Melanie Dawes, isn't it? But she's appointed by the government. So there's a direct link from the government to this executive branch, which is Ofcom. And when they start making laws and regulations that determine what is misinformation, which could easily be defined along political grounds, I'm sure it isn't explicitly, but I'm sure we can all imagine in the public discourse, someone says something, goes all the way back to like the GB News and all that sort of thing. Someone says something that's a bit edgy in one direction, that might be viewed with greater disfavour than something that's a bit edgy in the other direction. It's just subjective. And so that's what winds me up about all that. Well,
you'll be happy to know that we're not going to be making decisions on whether individual pieces of content are legal or illegal. It's going to be the platforms that are going to have to make those decisions, but it's based on guidance, which is based on, established case law and things like that, for example.
So there's legal and illegal, but are those platforms going to be able to be punished for permitting some of these vague terms that I've just been ranting about, like hate speech or misinformation? And in which case, on what basis? Because I don't know if there's enough precedent to be absolute about it.
Well, there are specific types of hate speech and disinformation that are illegal. So if you take disinformation, for example,
like rabble-rousing,
there's a criminal offence called the foreign interference offence. So if there's disinformation that's deliberately spread and it's linked to a particular state, there's a criminal offence linked to that. There's a false communications offence where if someone deliberately shares something that's false with the intention of causing harm. Yeah, there's a criminal offence linked to that.
That's another tricky one, which again is a law problem, not an Ofcom problem, with the intention of causing harm. That's again subjective. This is just a broader thing about subjectivity, which I'm sure I've already bored you two and our audience with. I'll just finish off before we move on, and I'll give you the last word, by the way, Harry, if you think there's other things to do with Ofcom that you'd like our audience to know about that we haven't covered. I've got a couple of anecdotal examples that sort of fuel my ire on this subject. There's one, I was listening to a podcast on the way in. There's a Daily Telegraph columnist called Alison Pearson. And last Sunday, the police knocked on her door and accused her of something called, again, this is just general law. This is just a tangent. I'm being self-indulgent here. This is Scott betraying a self-indulgent. I normally save that to the very end. And they accused her of a non-crime hate incident, which is something that we have in the UK. I know it's similar to this legal but harmful type of...
A non-crime hate incident? Why is the police involved then if it's a non-crime?
Well, it's a fucking good question, mate. Anyway, it is a thing that we have, and it was invented. It's not even a legal thing. It was invented by the College of Policing, I think. And they knocked on her door, and apparently she'd sent a tweet out a year ago. They were chasing up a tweet from a year ago. That was to do with something or other. Probably by the timing was probably something.
They should be out there catching burglars, Scott.
Well, indeed, I'll get very male reader on that subject. Like, no one's caught my burglar, but you're. I mean, I think there was one of the papers like the Mail or Telegraph when police the streets, not tweets, which is a very catchy thing. And anyway, and they went and picked on her, and she just happens to be a very prominent. They've got a massive podcast, her and Liam Halligan, which is called Planet Normal, which I listen to regularly, and that's what I was just listening to on the way. And anyway, basically knocked on her door and just gave her a hard time on a Sunday about some tweet, and they wouldn't even tell her what it was or what she said. All it was like, fucking watch yourself. So that creates this sort of Orwellian sort of surveillance state kind of vibe.
And then they're working through a list of tweets over the last few years, and they've just caught up.
Well, it's easy to believe, and this is the cops. This isn't regulators or even the government. This is the cops, but it's easy to believe that they are looking for low-hanging fruit. So rather than go after burglary.
The long arm of the state's quite weird, because one of my dad's mates, and he goes out in the pub in Wendover in Buckinghamshire, put something on Facebook a few years ago moaning about Labour and saying the best thing is if someone bumped him off
on
Facebook,
which is intemperate language.
Yeah,
But whether or not it was literally a call for assassination is
he's in
another
his
question.
70s. It's grumpy old man stuff.
Yeah.
But apparently some members of one of the MI departments came round to visit him to ask him questions because they were sort of thinking, where's this come from?
So that's it. It's that sort of sense of surveillance state. And then just one other little...
I suppose I have to follow some of this stuff up. So I don't know.
Yeah, and obviously we only hear about the outliers.
It's amusing when it comes down to pub level in Wendover with some 75-year-old.
And we don't hear about it when maybe some terrorists are messaging each other on Twitter and they get arrested and then they've stopped them blowing some shit up. So obviously you're going to get outliers and you're going to get sometimes where there seems to be overreach, and those are the ones that catch the attention of people like me. And then the only other thing that came up, this is a story I saw earlier on in the week. In Australia, this is written by ABC, their national broadcaster, and the headline says, social media, quote, duty of care, close quote, laws would force online giants to take preventative action on mental health harms. And this comes back, Harry, to my sort of like slippery slope or mission creep concerns, where they've already got stuff, they've already got the equivalent. In fact, I think they've actually got something called the Online Safety Act in Australia as well. And now they're looking, the party in charge right now is looking to add more things onto it. And that's where I get concerned, this sort of sedimentary mission creep, where they're now going, what's it, in short, this is reading ABC's report. In short, online platforms would be legally responsible for keeping Australians safe online under new digital duty of care laws. The federal government has committed to legislating the model, which was recommended as part of a broader independent review of the Online Safety Act. And so now, again, it's just this vague thing. They're basically going to do platforms if they haven't, in some, as far as I can tell from this one report, not very well defined, they've somehow fallen short of their digital duty of care. So I guess I'll just finish off on that. What do you think about my concerns about mission creep, about how we've got this thing now, but then in a year's time it might apply to more and more things and more people, and before we know it, we've got my Orwellian dystopian nightmare coming true?
Well, what you have with regulators is unelected officials, and the unelected officials can't change the law. So
yeah, rightly so.
It's down to the elected officials to have those debates and make those decisions on all our behalves. And ultimately where you're going to get to with this is a philosophical debate about how well democracy works. Yeah,
and, so, and the ideal role of the state and all that sort of stuff. Yeah.
And just on the priorities point you made earlier about burglars and whatever, what we've said is that we're going to have a particular focus on the worst, the most horrific stuff. So, we're going to have a particular focus on going after child sexual abuse material, grooming, fraud, the billions of pounds that people are scammed out of each year. And, we're going to have a particular priority on that kind of stuff, which,
good.
I think everyone will agree is a fairly worthy cause.
Yeah. Well, that's good. Yeah. And I will, I won't promise, but I'll vow next time I'm inclined to write some little snide aside about Ofcom saying if they can find time between busting people for tweets, I might reconsider and not put that at the end of my piece. But I can't promise anything. Cool. Right. We've got like less than half an hour left before we want to knock it on the head. Let's pivot in. Let's give the ball to you. What are the main themes that came out of Fyuz that are worth talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think the interesting thing about Fyuz is how it's changed in the last. It's almost a story in itself, actually. The evolution of the Fyuz event, because Fyuz is very much central to Open RAN. I mean, the Telecom Infra project, by the way, has been a bit of a car crash, I think, in the last few years. If you remember it being created in 2016.
Sorry, just last chance for a beer, Harry. What are you saying?
I think now that we've moved on to
now he's finished.
We're on the home stretch.
He's basically finished. So
Open RAN made me thirsty.
Yeah, I think if you remember it being formed, I think it was about 2016 by Facebook, as it was then.
Yeah.
And it was this big sort of ambitious intervention by at the time, arguably the most sort of attention grabbing of the hyperscalers, not hyperscalers, but the big tech companies. I think back then, it's sort of fallen from grace a little bit. I think Facebook,
or
Meta as it's called now,
because the metaverse really just became such a
massive thing. And everybody was like, "Well, what does this mean for the sector?" You know, Facebook getting involved in, you know, network infrastructure in the way they did in the sort of data center market, and the idea was get lower, you know, sort of spur innovation in this moribund market that's dominated by a few big kit suppliers, try and get sort of lower cost solutions out there, try and spur innovation. You know, they were talking about, I mean, I think the objectives for them really were, we've reached a certain limit now on the number of users that we've got in developed markets. If we can get connectivity costs down through equipment.
And they had all kinds of like wacky technologies to do with
balloons.
And all that stuff. Yeah, and they were all trying to get to the next billion people or whatever.
And TIP looks very, very different nowadays. You know, you look back at that time frame.
And it's not, Meta doesn't have such a big involvement in it now, does it?
Meta has hardly any involvement at all. So I think it is still involved, but it's not putting money in the way that it was a few years ago. And this is pretty much acknowledged actually by the TIP people themselves. It's not a TIP thing, and so the whole sort of appearance of the events changed a lot. I mean, you went to some of them a few years ago in London, and there was a lot of money being spent. You know, as journalists,
they gave good canapé.
Well, this is the thing. Attendees and journalists going to events, they're always like, what's the food like? What's the appearance of it like? And, you know, I remember going to the ones I don't really like going to the Excel Centre. It's a bit...
No.
But you used to turn up there and there's like these lavish sort of breakfast buffets and coffee on. And I don't want to say, it sounds like I'm being really nasty to TIP to say that now this latest one in Dublin was a bit of a retreat, you know, from that. But it's got cheaper.
Fair enough.
Know, it's inevitably got cheaper.
Well, if their budget's gone down, it's gone down.
The budget's inevitably come down. And it's I don't know, in a way, I suppose, if you're thinking that network innovation and some of this stuff we've been talking about for years, going right back to the time when NFV and NSDM were the big topics, and what kind of impact are they going to have on the telco sector? Really, they've not had any impact at all in terms of revitalising its fortunes or doing something for it on the profitability or sales front. It's all been quite disappointing, you know, in terms of bringing in alternative suppliers. I think in terms of doing anything for the telco business case itself, it's not really had the impact that I think a lot of people thought it might have years ago. And then I think more, you know, looking over a more recent time frame, a lot of the attention's been very, very specifically on Open RAN. Open RAN's quite new compared to some of these other, you know, disaggregation.
But Open RAN too, everything you just said then, you could have ascribed that description.
You could. So Open RAN's gone to a slightly shorter time frame. I think it's 2018 when the O-RAN Alliance got formed, a couple of years after TIP. At first, there was this concern about, well, isn't the O-RAN Alliance, this new group, doing a lot of the stuff that TIP said it would do? You know, there was a concern about, is there overlap in specifications? They seemed to rectify that. There was this view that in the Open RAN area, which is only one bit of what TIP was doing, but everything the O-RAN Alliance does, obviously, that TIP would sort of be led by O-RAN Alliance specs, and it would work on integration and this sort of thing, and actual real world use cases, and be more of a forum for people to meet. They sort of sorted that out. But you move on, whichever body you're talking about, you fast forward through 6 years now, and Open RAN is definitely not where it was expected to be.
It's not set the world on fire.
According to its advocates, right back in 2018. And I mean, one of the most noticeable things about TIP this year was possibly the biggest advocate of Open RAN, I think, going back to 2018, 2019, would have been Mavenir. Yeah. I mean, the three sort of, the three big companies, not big companies, but the three main proponents of Open RAN, I think, going back that sort of time frame, were Mavenir, Altiostar, and Parallel Wireless. They were sort of seen as the, you know, these software companies that would come along, all US based, and make some kind of.
Altiostar's part of NEC, is that right?
So Altiostar's now part of Rakuten.
Oh right. What was the NEC connection I was thinking?
NECs are there in Open RAN, but it's not.
Right.
But it's not Altiostar. Although they do. I mean, NEC figures quite prominently in the Rakuten rollout. So
fair enough.
but it's now part of Rakuten Symphony.
There's quite a lot of Japanese action going on.
Yeah, there is. Yeah. Parallel Wireless has really struggled. You know, they notably laid off a lot of staff a couple of years ago. I mean, the reports vary, 50% up to 80%, but they're not really considered to be an option for a macro rollout anymore. You know, they were really prominent actually in trials that Vodafone was doing a few years ago. Linked with the Huawei swap out, I think maybe even a consideration for a replacement for Huawei, but they wouldn't be anymore. Definitely not. Probably by their own admission. I think they have to go after sort of lower hanging fruit, private enterprise maybe, the sort of stuff that Orange was showcasing at the Olympics, where they had this small company called Amarisoft doing an Open RAN deployment for private 5G for people who were doing broadcasting tech. And then the other one's Mavenir, which is the biggest of the three, really, and has made a lot of money in core network side of things and on IMS. And Mavenir was, has been a real champion of Open RAN and was very prominent at the previous TIP events. Nowhere this year.
Really?
Didn't have a stand. John Baker, who we've had on the pod a couple of times, I think, at least once. Nowhere to be seen. They did have somebody there. I know there was someone there.
But in terms of their presence, it was massively diminished.
Panel sessions, speeches, nothing. And who was the panel session that attracted the most attention? Also, I would say it's quite interesting, the change in leadership, because they have their kind of chairman of the board, which has been a guy that we both know reasonably well, Iago Tenorio at Vodafone, or used to be at Vodafone, but left recently to go to Verizon.
That's right.
And he's relinquished his chairman role now to a chap called Rob Sony, who's at AT&T. And so it's quite strange that all the focus really this year, I thought a lot of the focus was on AT&T and Ericsson and its Open RAN rollout that they announced
which, as we've covered lots of times on the pod, is in some ways Open RAN in name only.
Which you have to be incredibly sceptical about as a true Open RAN deployment. You know, it involves taking out a lot of Nokia equipment and replacing that with Ericsson equipment. There's a role carved out for Fujitsu, but it became apparent actually at the event this week that all Fujitsu is doing is small cells. They're not doing macro network stuff.
Right.
Ericsson's providing all of the baseband software. Ericsson's providing all of the SMO systems. Ericsson's providing the RIC. Ericsson will be providing most of the RIC applications. It's an Ericsson-led rollout. You know, you have compatibility with these interfaces, but it hasn't really changed the game in terms of opening up opportunities.
So just to reiterate the point you're making, if Open RAN is all about opening up interfaces in order to enable the participation of lots of different players, what the fuck is the point in getting all your Open RAN stuff off one player?
Yeah, and I guess to steelman their position, they'd say, well, you know, we create a position where in the future we can introduce other people more easily, or we can replace Ericsson more easily, potentially. As long as those interfaces are open, you have the option of bringing somebody in alongside Fujitsu as a radio supplier.
You've got the option, but if in practice you're not doing it.
You've got this area called the RIC, which is the RAN Intelligent Controller. I mean, it often gets...
I was trying to remember what that stood for.
But it often gets likened to a sort of app store for the network. So you run a kind of... an app that might power down base stations.
So that goes all the way back to NFV and all that sort of thing, being able to just dip into little functions.
It's like a software layer on the network, but it controls parts of the network. So you could sort of program. This is the idea of this programmable network that Ericsson keeps going on about. But you could say if footfall's very low in a neighbourhood at night, then you can program it to sort of take power down at base stations and save cost. And that could be quite important for telcos in terms of cost savings. And I don't doubt that there's some innovation there on the RIC side, but the RIC in itself is never going to be a big money spinner, I don't think. And there's a lot of interest in the RIC. I find a little bit confusing because I don't really see, other than the energy savings from the example I just gave and things like load balancing, you know, where we got lots of people in a cell at the moment because there's an event happening, there's some concert going on. You can sort of apportion capacity dynamically through a sort of RIC application potentially. But
which makes sense. That was one of the things, actually, very quick tangent. I mentioned at the start of the pod that I went and chatted to Interdigital, and it's just jogged my memory. One of the things they were talking about, and obviously AI always comes up these days, it's very much the sort of buzzword du jour. But, one of the things that's going to come up more, and I think AI is one of the 6G hexagons. And you think, well, whatever, AI, everyone's fucking talking about AI. Although I'll encourage you to talk about that in a story you wrote in a sec. But you can do clever things when you're using spectrum that has inferior propagation characteristics, so mid-band and upwards and up to millimeter wave, which we didn't really speak about it, but Ofcom had an announcement about millimeter wave auction in the UK this week. We know millimeter wave is quite shite in terms of its propagation characteristics. Our joke is that you've got to be sitting on a base station in order to, and that's obviously a deliberate exaggeration. But there's all sorts of clever things you can do with AI where it basically automatically follows your phone around and is able to direct that. There's technology, beamforming's been around for a while, but there's other little clever things that I don't know the names for. But basically, it can overcome some of these propagation challenges by just focusing the radio beam specifically on your device through all sorts of cleverness.
Yeah, massive MIMO.
So that was just something you just jogged my memory. That's a thing that came up there. But carry on, sorry.
Yeah, well, that area, massive MIMO, that's an area it's particularly hard to do Open RAN, to have a different sort of radio unit provider from the Open RAN originally was about opening the front hall. So that's the bit between the radio and the kind of compute infrastructure, really, the baseband.
Yeah.
Which in a traditional radio access network you get on the same mast. It's like the radio unit antenna stuff's at the top, and then if you look at the bottom, there's like loads of compute gubbins, and then you've got a link between
gubbins
them.
Is a good technical term.
But if you one of the ideas with Open RAN, the original idea of Open RAN really was this notion that because those are the two big items, those are the two big cost items. So this is this idea that you could get your compute systems from a different person than your radio unit provider, which has been hard to do in the past because you've got this link between them called CIPRI, which is it's sort of implemented in a proprietary way, which makes it very hard to sort of then, sort of use Ericsson and get a Mavenir radio unit with it. And therefore you've got these specifications that open that up, and then you can sort of mix and match vendors. But it's very hard to do with massive MIMO, even with an open interface, apparently.
Okay.
Because you need to have such a close match between the algorithms on both sides that you'd have to have like really close collaboration between the two vendors, like one of them changing their algorithms potentially.
Indeed. So it's not open.
The problem with the interfaces is that they haven't.
It's not plug and play.
It's never, and it probably never will be plug and play. That's the trouble. I mean, that's why systems integration is such a big deal in Open RAN. But even when you have these open interfaces, you still have to have this issue of actually putting the things together and working on the job of doing that. You can't just sort of come along and, as you say, just plug it in. It's not like a Lego piece that you just do that with and it works. So it's not, that's one reason I think it's not kind of changed the game in terms, this idea of, this expression at the moment, single vendor Open RAN, because most of the deployments so far have been a company saying, an operator saying, well, we want it to be Open RAN compatible, but you still buy everything from the same vendor. And that's pretty much what's happening with the AT&T deployment, is they're making it Open RAN compatible, but most of it's still coming from Ericsson. And I think even if you did solve some of those systems integration challenges and get over some of the remaining interface problems, are they going to buy radios separately from the baseband supplies? It just, what do you get out of it? This is the issue. What's to be gained from it? There might be specific deployments where there might be specific areas where you've got a radio unit vendor that's really catered to that kind of the characteristics that you find in that area very well, and it's perhaps fallen off. It's not something that Ericsson's been bothered about because they're more interested in a global market where it's a one-size-fits-all approach. This is being very generalistic, by the way, because Ericsson would deny that. But I'm just saying there might be a case where you've got very, very specific characteristics in a certain geography that you want to serve, and there's this radio unit vendor that's done it. And there you could say, well, we're going to use this radio unit vendor there and stick with, obviously, with Ericsson for the baseband. But is it going to happen across a big geographical area? I just don't really see. There's not any obvious savings because there's nothing really different about the equipment in itself. So
indeed, and the savings, the
savings would come from competition. That was
indeed. I was just I was gonna just refer this to our earlier conversation with Ofcom without Harry. Don't worry. Asking you to opine at great length on the pros and cons of Open RAN.
Well, rather embarrassingly, we've used the Lego analogy previously, but
I think the Lego analogy is fine though up to a point because I've used it as well. It's a good analogy.
But the only reason I was pivoting back to Ofcom,
it's a Lego analogy with an instruction book held in front of you where you're going, where does this bit go? And you need to get your dad involved.
It's like when you buy your kid the Millennium Falcon for Christmas.
Yeah,
you end up
it's that Lego analogy.
All of Boxing Day making the fucking thing,
and you have spare bits of some pieces and not enough of others.
Yeah, exactly. Why have I got more guns? But we were talking about the balance that Ofcom has to strike in terms of market dynamics. And what they're trying to do with Open RAN is basically a pro-market theory, which is more players equals more competition equals better value, equals a more vibrant market. But in practice, and I'll refer you because we're running out of time here. And at least one of your stories from the event I wanted to queue up in case there's some stuff in it that you haven't covered already. But if you've got this sudden vibrant open market enabled by this technology paradigm called Open RAN, but you're still buying all your shit off one person, is that a bit of a mirage? And I just noticed you had one story that you'd written and you'd taken a photo from Fyuz. It's obviously a Fyuz thing. Yeah. And your headline was, Ericsson has limited plans for Open RAN in its juiciest 5G. Is that something we've already covered? Or
no, that's quite
okay.
New.
Well, tell us a bit more about that.
I mean, AT&T and Ericsson were on stage a lot this week. They had sessions that were the most well-attended sessions. How interesting is that? Open RAN originally was conceived of this, let's get smaller suppliers into the market, let's spur people like Mavenir, let's get optionality.
Parallel,
the most attended session. Yeah. And almost Ericsson was never a presence, by the way, at TIP stuff in the past, wasn't a member of it. Now it's almost like they've hijacked the whole thing. I say this liaising with Ericsson a lot, and I don't have anything against Ericsson, but they've done this very good job, I think, of how do we prevent Open RAN from, pulling the rug from under us, kind of thing. They probably saw this potential challenge coming.
Because it was an existential problem for them initially, because their whole business model was this monolithic.
I wonder how worried they were about it, knowing the market circumstances, knowing that it's the same. I mean, I've spoken with senior people at Ericsson before and had this message come back that the RAN market the global market for 5G equipment requires economies of scale, to have standards that work across the world to drive costs down for consumers. This is an area that Ofcom would appreciate, to have interoperability, to be able to produce these very, very expensive to build products that go on, that go up and down. It's a scale game. It's like the chips business.
Yeah.
You're not going to have 6 or 7 TSMCs across the planet.
And you don't have sudden spikes in revenue.
And that's the problem for anybody trying to compete against an Ericsson or a Nokia, is that or Huawei in particular, is they spend vast sums on R&D each year in a market that's not growing, it's actually shrinking. Shrinking, by the way, quite a lot, 10 to 15% this year. An odd market to want to enter if you're a new entrant.
Yes.
Requires economies of scale. It requires a huge commitment to R&D. It's very hard to break into. You produce a load of radios at high cost. Unless you're selling those immediately, they have to be updated and replaced every year. If you're not making the revenues, it's hard to. This is why we hear reports about some of these companies being in trouble. Parallel Wireless one is notable. But that Ericsson story, I mean, that's maybe not enough time to go into it now, but it turns out they aren't committed fully to Open RAN in some of the areas. So Massive MIMO, their baseband products, the stuff on the compute side that we were talking about, they're not opening that up to Open RAN for Massive MIMO. They have no plans to do that, which is in contradiction of their statements that they came out with recently, where they said they were fully on board with Open RAN.
So my working theory of why and what you've reported and observed about Fyuz having a greater than ever presence from AT&T, which albeit their chairman the TIP chairman is now this geezer Sonny from AT&T, and Ericsson. My working theory is geopolitical, which is that back in 2018, 2019, 2020, when the Yanks really started putting the heat on Huawei and China and from a telecoms point of view, and let's not forget Trump's back in now, but his whole pitch back in 2015-16 was China, China, China.
Yeah.
And
it still is.
Yeah, exactly. So he was setting them up as their great sort of geopolitical antagonist, and the Biden presidency carried on with that. And we've got all this stuff that I write about in quite a sort of opinionated way these days about how I think America's overreaching on that one. But my understanding is to Americans, especially maybe politicians and generalist regulators, maybe like the SEC or whatever, who didn't know a lot about telecoms, they saw Open RAN as some kind of solution to the problem of their own making, which was we've created a duopoly among big telecoms kit vendors of Ericsson and Nokia because we banned Chinese vendors.
Well, I don't think that...
Let me just quickly finish and then by all means correct me. And I think as a result of that, because people like AT&T and Ericsson know it's very politically popular to be on board the Open RAN train, I think they pay a lot of lip service to it. But what you're reporting seems to point to the fact that for all that lip service, the actual practical implementation is quite minimal.
Yeah, I don't really agree with everything you said there.
No, please don't.
Because I think the US angle on it is it's a problem of their own making. Like Huawei and ZTE were never used really in the US.
They were for a bit in those rural networks.
Yeah, okay, but they weren't, apart from someone doing something in Nebraska, they were never really used in the US. They certainly weren't used in the three big networks.
Fair enough.
That account for 98% of the market or something. They weren't the providers to those companies. The pushback, a lot of the concerns about Huawei and ZTE came a long before the Trump administration. They're actually raised by Obama.
So let me slightly reposition it. I think America viewed Open RAN as a way of getting, how another Trump thing is very much national populism, like supporting domestic manufacture and domestic companies and reshoring and all that sort of thing. Maybe they viewed Open RAN as a way of giving America a chance to be a major player in telecoms again in a way that it wasn't.
Well, maybe they did, but if they did, then I think that was very misconstrued as well. Because
I agree.
Because just because you don't have a big RAN vendor doesn't mean that you're not incredibly significant in mobile technology.
And they got Qualcomm and they got Google and Apple. And
you just mentioned it. Who's the company that makes the most out of intellectual property in mobile?
Yeah, no, they're doing fine.
It's Qualcomm.
I know, but they're greedy. They want more.
Who does the chips for all this stuff that goes into these Ericsson and Marvell and Nokia? Marvell's one of them.
Marvell's another American company.
Who are the cloud platforms that support the cloud RAN networks that this is going to go on? They're US companies. So yeah, they don't have the radio unit vendors in the US in the way that the Europeans do, but they have it. If that's what they want, I don't know. It's a strange area to think that you need to be prominent. And I think a lot of this.
I reckon I could be talking shit, but that's a
no. I think there is some of that. I think one of the problems that happened a few years ago is that people thought 5G was more important than it's actually turned out to be.
Yes.
I think there was this thing where it's okay to have Huawei and ZTE in Europe's 4G networks because 4G, what the hell, it's just doing mobile broadband, what the hell. 5G, that's going to be powering fighter jets and pumping insulin into people's bodies.
And controlling
if the Chinese took over it, they could zap everybody immediately. And actually 5G's turned out to be a bit shit.
Not so much.
I wonder I know there's some people expecting that when Trump gets back in the White House in January, he's maybe going to do something that Biden didn't do and actually find a way of getting Huawei out of these sort of European networks where it's still present. Like Germany, for instance, be very resistant to doing anything.
He'll certainly rattle Huawei, the cage a bit, that's for sure.
Maybe, I don't think it's going to be very high on their priority list, to be honest with you, at first. I'm not completely convinced, but anyway.
We're right at the hour. Yeah, is he starting to do throat cutting gestures?
No. Oh, he's not. No, I was just going to say...
if you've got some stuff you want to round off on.
Well, yeah, just going back to the diversification and, Ericsson being this fairly dominant... I think there's a problem definitely with the market structure at the moment in terms of what Open RAN was supposed to achieve. And you can see this in Omdia's data. Omdia's come out with some market updates recently.
We could have got into that on a different day.
I mean, where I would agree with you on the, we need to have something there because there's been a lot of consolidation is, there's basically been a lot of consolidation. We've gone down from a situation, I think, 10 years ago where we had, 10, 11 maybe companies doing radio access network equipment. You had people like Nortel, you had Motorola in that market, you had Alcatel and Lucent as separate companies, you had Ericsson, you had Nokia, you had Siemens, you had a huge array of companies competing to sell RAN infrastructure, and it's all consolidated down to 3 big kit vendors, basically.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of the blame has probably been laid at the foot of Huawei, because it's come in from China and it's been very price competitive, and there's this perception that other companies weren't able to compete. People like Nortel and Motorola ended up having to sell assets. We've gone down to 3 vendors, and people don't like the telcos are nervous about it, and they were especially nervous, I think, when Nokia had all those 5G product problems a few years ago.
Yeah.
And then you're thinking, hang on a minute. Now, if we can't use Nokia either, it's only Ericsson, and then Huawei's getting banned. And that, I think, definitely was a reason why people were sort of thinking Open RAN needs to, we need to actually do something about this and have alternatives. But it just hasn't really produced anything. I mean, the one company that people talk about a lot in connection with Open RAN that's been a bit of a success story is Samsung.
Yes.
Is this alternative?
It's given them a route, perhaps a slightly easier route in.
I'm not sure. I'm not completely convinced that Samsung wouldn't have been there anyway without Open RAN, because I think if you look at most of the deployments that are happening with where they have been especially big is Cloud RAN, which is not the same thing. People get the two mixed up.
God knows I do.
Yeah, but they're very strong in that. They're perceived to be very strong in that area. But most of the deployments that Samsung's doing, this classic issue of radios, baseband coming from the same vendor or separate vendors, it's usually coming always from Samsung. Yeah. They're rated very highly in all areas. They're not a specialist. They're not one of these companies that you go, well, we'll give them a bit of a bump up. If you make it easier for companies to slot in, then it helps specialists because they couldn't fit in before because of these closed interfaces. They're not that at all. They do everything. I think they'd have been there anyway. I think they would have had a role even without Open RAN. So I'm not convinced that Open RAN's done anything really so far.
All right, mate. I'm sorry to cut you short. I know we could have spoken more about this, and sorry, Harry, for covering stuff that's not in your home territory. But I would just want to finish off by saying thanks again, Harry, for coming on. It's I was really looking forward to this for a while, engaging with the operator that has so much influence over what we write about and what we do. So thanks to you, and thanks to Ofcom for letting you come in.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, no, maybe this won't be, hopefully not a surprise to people at HQ, but...
yes, exactly. What the fuck, Harry?
No, thanks, because you said it earlier, myth busting. I mean, all I try and do is make sure that people understand our side, what we're doing, what we're trying to achieve, how we have to do things sometimes.
And the constraints within which you work. And I think... I'm sure in times in the future, I will still bitch and moan about the speed at which public sector does stuff.
I hope you do.
Indeed. No, not once have you ever complained about the tone. And obviously, I'm sure you'd be the first to admit that we need a vibrant media to keep everyone in check. But yes, it's very useful. If what your real interest is just understanding the truth and facts and how things work, then you need to hear it from all directions. So I'm grateful for that. Thank you very much. I gather you got a gig to go to later, but you're welcome to join us for a pint or two after this if you fancy it.
Are you playing?
No, you're just going.
No, just going. Just saying, it depends what the inbox is looking like. Friday afternoons.
Oh, I see. Right.
Journalists have a habit of...
Oh, I see. Right. Well, you can check your inbox in the pub. Anyway, it's up to you, but you're welcome. And it's great chatting to you, and thanks a lot for coming in, mate.
Thanks very much.
Okay, so I'll leave it at that. I think the next one we're going to record a little bit early before the Glotel Awards that are happening a week on Thursday, so like in 6 days' time, or 4 days' time from when you see this.
This Thursday.
This Thursday, yeah. So thanks a lot for listening, and make sure you join us for that one.